Good evening to our viewers in Germany and hello to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Since the beginning of August, the Social Democrats have seen a jump from 16 to 26% in opinion polls during the final weeks leading up to Germany's federal election. And the SPD's Kanzlerkandidat, Olaf Scholz, is largely credited with this turnaround. In snap polls, following each of the three television debates between the three candidates for Chancellor, Scholz was declared the winner for projecting continuity after Angela Merkel leaves office and received very high ratings from viewers. Olaf Scholz, of course, has a number of important advisors, but few of them are as close to him as Wolfgang Schmidt, who currently serves as State Secretary in the Federal Ministry of Finance. Wolfgang, I want to thank you so much for joining us today during this final stretch of campaigning to talk about the turnaround of the SPD and to help us get to know Olaf Scholz.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm happy to be with you, especially as you know, in these final stretches of a campaign. It's quite good to have something to do and not to bite your nails because you become so nervous what might happen.
And I think a lot of people are asking the same question. We'll know a lot more Sunday night and Monday morning. But until then, I think you're absolutely right. It is a nail biter. You know, over the last few months, sort of watching the German press, listening to observers and pundits who watch Germany very closely, many people have been asking the question of whether the Social Democratic Party could make a comeback and actually lead a center-left coalition. And for you, Wolfgang, there has never been any doubt in your mind about this or about Olaf Scholz's ability to lead. I remember hearing you many months ago, I want to say it was April or May, saying, don't count him out. Let's just wait and see. Why were you convinced so early on that he's the right man for the job right now?
Well, the easy answer would be because he is, and I've known him for now 25 years or so, and I'm deeply convinced that people, I was deeply convinced, I still am, that people would realize that he might be the right one, especially if you look at the two other candidates. But I think there is kind of a more objective answer maybe, and that is that we are facing an historic election. After 16 years, the incumbent, Chancellor Merkel, is not running again. And that obviously changes the dynamics. And so you have, for the first time in German history, no incumbent running for office. Then I say that there is also a thing called democracy, and many voters have a strong feeling that it is good to have change after 16 years of one party being in power and holding the position of the Chancellor. And so these are the two main factors. And then, but now I'm biased, obviously. My feeling is that Olaf Scholz presented a plan, both for the party, but also for the country, and that we have a rare moment that voters are looking both for continuity and something that they liked about Merkel, and they want a plan, and they want a clearer vision for the future and what the parties want for that future. And I think Olaf Scholz kind of was, and is the right combination of these two. So you have the candidate from the Conservative Party who basically said, look, I was always underestimated and finally I won. And I'm the guy able to kind of bring together different groups of society. And then you had the Green candidate who said it's all about change. And because of the climate crisis, we really need to change. So experience, governmental experience does not count. And I think people had a feeling that you need both the calm hand and the expertise that Merkel had, but you also need a little bit more than just continuity. And maybe that's why Olaf Scholz was finally the candidate that brought together these two ideas.
So it sounds almost a little contradictory, right? To think of this as a change election because there is no incumbent and it's an open field, but at the same time that there's a real desire for continuity, and that this is actually something that Olaf Scholz has sort of been able to turn into an advantage for him. Often the Social Democrats have been seen as the junior partner in the coalition with the Christian Democrats, and they've been overshadowed by that. That's been a long liability frequently for the party in the past. Do you think that this time the fact that Angela Merkel is not running again has really given him the opportunity to present himself as the closest thing to continuity, even though he's from a different party from Chancellor Merkel's party?
Yeah, I would say this is one part of his success. So he's the closest thing to an incumbent as the vice chancellor. And as you did in the US, you just erased the vice of president, and then you had former vice president turned into president. And this is something that might happen here again. But I think he also gave not only the SPD, but also the country a plan and an idea of what is needed in these days. And Nathan Goebbels in Noema magazine, he wrote an article about this election campaign, and the headline of this was "The Reverse Deplorables Campaign in Germany." And I think this is something very important. So what Olaf Scholz very early on, actually for many years, has argued is, and now we see that in this campaign, that it is centered around the phrase of respect. So not to make the mistakes that we saw with Hillary Clinton's campaign, talking about the basket of the worker. After having read The Tyranny of Merit, he is of the strong belief that we need to have a society that is based around respect, and regardless of your occupation or of your education, that everybody should have a place in that society. And it should not be the case that one part of society looks down on the other. And I think this is something that resonates with many people who kind of felt excluded also of the public and political discourse. So that's one element. The second element is, and you mentioned the Grand Coalition and what the Grand Coalition and this kind of perceived permanent participation in the Grand Coalition made the SPD suffer, that when we started this Grand Coalition in March 2018, we took a different approach. So we said, yes, it's necessary to govern in a constructive way together, because people do not like their government fighting each other and having controversies all the time. But we also said we need to make clear that these are actually two different parties in government, and there is something that is unique about the SPD. So from the very beginning, we talked not only about what we achieved as the government and what we wanted to achieve as the government, but we also talked about those things that a social democratic chancellor or social democratic party on its own would do. For example, increasing the minimum wage to €12 an hour, which is a very popular item and would affect actually 10 million people out of 43 million that is our workforce. Or having a stable and secure pension, or that we are not in favor of tax cuts for those who earn a lot of money. So for the 10% highest income earners. So these were three very concrete items that from the very beginning we were stressing, and the Conservative Party was constantly saying, we don't want this. And I think this was quite important, because when come election time and the campaign time, and you start new proposals that people have never heard of, they accuse you that you only say these things because it's election season, and so that you don't really mean it. And so then there is a lack of trust. And by stressing these things for the last 3 years, people now believe the SPD, that they really mean it, and that the candidate is really into that. And I think that helped to have a contrast, because after 12 years of grand coalition, there is a perception that both the Conservative Party, CDU, and the Social Democratic Party, SPD, are kind of merged into one kind of system party. And we needed to make sure that that people understand that it's actually two different parties, and so that an election does matter. Because in the past, if you have like this systemic party, and it doesn't really matter whether you vote SPD or CDU, then many people stayed at home. And Merkel and her party famously developed a strategy that they called the strategy of the asymmetrical demobilization, thinking that the church-going conservative on election day, which in Germany is always a Sunday, would go to church and afterwards would cast their vote. Meanwhile, the lazy social democrat, if the election is not really about something, would stay in bed or have brunch or whatsoever, and would not go to the election because it doesn't really matter. And they're perfectly okay with Merkel as a kind of pseudo social democrat. And so we need to make sure that people understand this election does matter, and what this election is really about. And I think this is now understood, and people actually know what the Social Democratic Party and their candidates stand for.
So, Wolfgang, let me push you on that a little bit. I think it's important, and you've said this, it's a historic election because it's the end of the era of Angela Merkel. It's a historic election because there's a new opportunity. The election matters because of the issues that are on the table and on the agenda. But as I think back over the last 3 or 4 elections, each time the Social Democrats have lost in support. And there have been calls from within the party, but also from the electorate, that it was time for the party to sort of reinvent itself, that there would be a stronger delineation between each of the political parties, but particularly between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, so that people knew what the party stands for. As an outside observer, granted, an observer very far away in the United States, watching German politics, it seems to me as if the turnaround that we've seen for the Social Democrats has largely been credited to Olaf Scholz and his popularity, and not necessarily to a new party platform or a reinvention of the Social Democratic Party. So how do you sort of see the interplay between the Kanzlerkandidat, who's not the party leader, it's worth mentioning as well, and what's going on in the party at the moment?
Is what we expected with this popular politician, that once people realize that Merkel indeed is gone or will be gone soon, people would concentrate on the question, who of the 3 candidates is actually capable? And then people would actually start to listen what these candidates are saying. So that then the candidate talking about the manifesto and the platform, people would also realize what this platform and what the party's ideas are about. And then obviously you have it on the billboards, and you have a cohesion between what he is saying in his stump speeches in in his public appearances, in the television, and what people see out in the streets. And my take is that he very early on, so we presented him a year before the election in August 2020, and started then the progress or the process of developing a party platform for the election. And he inserted his ideas into that process. And so many of his proposals then became the party position. And so what you described as some lack of trust in the party or exhaustion with the party that we witnessed in the past was then, I think, reversed. And now it seems, and we made sure that the party platform has a positive tone and it's optimistic and not you might call it typical social democratic approach of saying, oh, these things, and focusing on the negative things and things that are not going well, but rather having an optimistic approach and looking at our society and our economy, and then addressing the shortcomings and providing solutions. So I think this whole thing helped us to transfer his popularity to his fault, but also his opponents made some mistakes during the campaign, and that obviously helped us at the end to actually be now 2 percentage points ahead in the latest polls just before the election. But it's very narrow, everything.
So I actually, you've brought this up a couple times, and I did want to ask you about it, because some people, have argued that it's not just about the success of Olaf Scholz, but rather the weaknesses of Armin Laschet of the Christian Democrats and Annalena Baerbock of the Greens. He has not had any gaffes. He has presented himself as being sure-footed and substantive, and has really worked very hard, as you've described, to build up trust and to demonstrate stability. So there are these two things that are going on. One is, he's presenting himself as the strongest candidate of the three. The other two have made some mistakes, but you're saying he also has, that it's not just that. He also has a plan for Germany under an SPD-led government.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Olaf Scholz's political career, you see that he was the mayor, and in our system, he's also the governor and then the senator for the city-state of Hamburg, so one of the 16 states. And he won there in 2011 an absolute majority, which back then was very unique. And then he sought re-election in 2015 and won nearly 46%. And the next party, the Christian Democratic, the Conservative Party of Mrs. Merkel, ended up 30 percentage points below the SPD. So if you then see that he, as I said, has always been one of the most popular politicians in public polling since he became the finance minister and the vice chancellor, something is there that's about him. And it's not only the flaws and the mistakes of the others. And I also think that plan beats no plan, the good old saying, helps a lot. But when we talked in I think April, and I always try to explain why I think the race is open and Olaf Scholz will become the chancellor. I also never expected that the SPD would be ahead of the CDU. So that bit, I would acknowledge, is because of mistakes of the CDU. I think it's not only the obvious ones, and there's one famous image of the candidate of the Conservative Party laughing in the background of the federal president when the federal president was delivering a short speech in a horrible flooding that we saw in the summer. And so people perceive that a little bit as inappropriate. That is, I think, one element, obviously, and everybody has this image in his or her mind. But then there is this notion, I would say, and I'm partisan here, that there, I think, is a feeling of complacency with the Conservative Party, because they have been in power now, and somehow some of them, I think, believe that it's not the natural order of things that they occupy the chancellery. If you look back into history, it was only 3 times that the SPD actually came in as the largest party or the biggest party in an election. And so there is this notion that you do not need to do so much because things move in your direction. And as you mentioned, the polling numbers that we had a year ago, like 50% or 14%, and the Conservative Party way above 25, even reaching 30, there was a lot of confidence that this would continue. So the first, I think, irritation came in the spring when after the Greens announced their candidate, a 40-year-old female leader, then they bumped and even overtook the Conservatives for a few weeks. And I think that was the first moment of irritation, that they should do more. But it's also very complicated to develop a plan within a few weeks or even few months. And I think that is where their campaign began to stumble. And people did not realize that until it then materialized in mid-August.
So let's stick with the party for just a few more minutes, because I do think it's fascinating to think about the fact that the Social Democrats are now polling at about 25-26% of the vote. It's much better than the 15 or 16% that they were polling at for much of the year. It's better than the 20% that they won in the 2017 election, but it's a far cry from the 35 to 40% that the party once had as a Volkspartei, as a catch-all party. This moment, this election, might be a pivotal point for the party, might be a tremendous opportunity for the party moving ahead, but there are also some tremendous divisions within the party. And I think it's important to say that Olaf Scholz has positioned himself as a centrist moderate, but there are more left-leaning factions within the party. How do you think, starting next week after the election, the party will sort of rally around Olaf Scholz, and how do you think it will address some of the divisions that exist within the party?
Well, first of all, I think that nearly all party members, if we succeed, obviously this is a big if all the time, if we succeed, most party members will know who's responsible for that. And that it is mainly Olaf Scholz, and his popularity then transferred to the party. The second element of that success is that there is party unity. So when he was presented as the candidate of the party by the 2 presidents of the party that actually won against him in the internal party leadership election a year before that, that was a strong signal that the party is united. And I think a party can kind of pretend and forge unity for like half a year or something like that. But for over a year, that's impossible, at least for the SPD. And so journalists and people started to believe that we are not just talking about unity and how united the party is, but they actually started to believe it when they saw, okay, this really lasted, and now this has lasted for over a year. So that is, I think, the second element besides his popularity, that they see the party is united. So my guess is that it will continue after the after the election. And again, I come back to this notion of Olaf Scholz had a plan, and he gave the party a plan. I think what the SPD now realized is that actually this plan and the manifesto is quite a good one. And I think you cannot describe it as leftish or center, but it's just good. So for example, how would you describe a minimum wage of 12 euro? Maybe in the past you would have said, oh yeah, that's a leftish agenda. Now it's probably center or left of center agenda, or a centrist agenda. So I personally, I don't think that these left-right narratives are really describing what is going on any longer. And maybe a last word on, because you said like the good old days of 35% or even 40% for the SPD are over. I think for the moment they're over for all the political parties in Germany, and we see that with the CDU as well. And you could describe that as a Scandinavization of German politics. So we have a way more fragmented political landscape, so that most probably in this election, we will see parties oscillating around 20 to 25%, and others then around 10 and 15. And that's something that's completely normal in Scandinavia. So if you look at Denmark, if you look at Sweden, if you look even at Finland, you have premier ministers that obtained 26 in Denmark, 28 in Sweden, and less than 18, but with a 5-party coalition % in Finland. So that's a normality that we see in other countries that have such a fragmented political landscape. And if you look at our second chamber, the Bundesrat, you would see that in 8 of the 16 states, you now have 3-party coalitions. And the traditional coalitions that we had in Germany was one big party and one smaller party, be it the Conservatives was the Liberal Party or the SPD was the Green Party. These two models only govern in one state of 16 each. So in my hometown, Hamburg, and Olaf Scholz's former place of being the minister president, the mayor, it is red-green. And where Mr. Laschet is coming from and where he's the minister president in North Rhine-Westphalia, it's black-yellow, as we call this coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Liberals. And that's it. And so the old times with this 40-plus party and then an additional 7 to 10% party that then they form a 2-party coalition, it's over. And I think it won't easily come back. It will always be possible. So we will have state elections at the same time on Sunday. And in the northern part of Germany, in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, a young leader of the Social Democratic Party at the moment in the polls is around 39%. So she might even achieve 40, who knows? So it is possible. But the general rule, I think, is more fragmented. And so we will see lower election results as a result of that.
I mean, I think your presentation of just the changing political landscape is a very good one. The fact that there is a more fragmented political spectrum in Germany, and that has a significant impact on the possibilities and on the options that a governing coalition might have. I'm happy also that you mentioned the fact that there are 2 state elections coming up: Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, and in Berlin, where the Social Democrats are also looking very strong. Undoubtedly, strong wins in those 2 state elections would help the Social Democrats at the federal level as well. But I think there are lots of questions about the coalition options and what lies ahead. And we'll know more on Sunday evening and Monday morning about what's mathematically possible. It will take a little bit longer to figure out what's politically viable. And one of our viewers is very curious about those options. I'm sure many of our viewers are, but one has written that if a 3-party coalition becomes necessary, assuming that the Social Democrats would work with the Green Party, would Olaf Scholz prefer to work with the liberal Free Democratic Party or with the left-leaning Linkspartei?
Yeah, I think that's easy to answer. So it's clearly if a three-party coalition is the outcome, so then the preferred option will be, as we call it here, the traffic light. So with the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Liberal Party, whose color is yellow. There is in Germany kind of a game just before the elections that candidates and parties are always asked to rule out certain coalition options. So the Christian Democrats, for example, asked the Liberals to rule out that they would participate in such a traffic light thing. And they demanded that from them as a clear signal so that the voters would know. And the Christian Democrats then asked the Social Democrats and Olaf Scholz that he needs to rule out a coalition with the left-wing party. And then people from our side were demanding the Greens, that they should rule out Jamaica, so the coalition between the black conservatives and the yellow liberals and them. And people were then asking us to rule out another grand coalition or a Belgium coalition that is called Germany coalition with the blacks, so the conservatives, us, and the liberals. So at the end of this kind of hit the pot game would be that we wouldn't need an election, because then the only option would be that's left, and that was not ruled out by any party. And so we early on decided that we won't play this pot hitting game, but we would stick to what this election is about, and then make clear on what ground any coalition would be possible. And so we have a clear decision by the party dating back to 2013, when we said we won't rule out any coalition with the exception of the right-wing AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. And there is conditions for any participation in a government, and that is a strong commitment to NATO, a clear commitment to deployment of German soldiers out of Germany if necessary, a clear commitment towards the European Union. And so if you look then at the party platforms and manifestos and the actual behavior, you as a voter can see what kind of coalition is then really possible. So I think this is clear enough so that people would know what to expect from a Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And he even said that the commitment to NATO should be wholehearted.
Mm-hmm. So that, if I interpret what you're saying, that would make a coalition that includes the left party very unlikely, given the left party's position on some of these issues. And yet there's a reluctance to come out and say that the Social Democrats will not form a coalition with the left party.
Yeah, because we think that it's now the time of the voters and it's high time for democracy. And we should not talk about ruling out this or that, but talk about what is at stake and what is the proposals that we make, what's our plan, then to discuss the others' plan if they have one. And so that's what voters are interested in. It's interesting. We have a lot of these town hall meetings in TV where normal people ask questions. And very seldomly, the question of the coalition comes up. Most of the questions are around housing, pensions, wages, health, COVID, environment, climate, and so on and so on. So this is the things people are actually interested in. And the whole coalition thing is more of inside baseball between politicians and journalists. And I think it is important to understand that people really want to get to know what the party stands for. And obviously, every party then says, if you want a clear and stable government, you have to vote for me or my party. And the stronger one party becomes, the less necessary a three-party coalition is, or would be.
So your point is well taken, and undoubtedly, again, we'll know more Sunday about what the options actually are. And as we've observed in past coalition negotiations, the devil is always in the details, and these negotiations can be quite protracted. It might take a while before a new government actually forms. But turning to another party that the Social Democrats might work with, one of our viewers points out that the Free Democrats and the Social Democrats have often appeared to be at odds with each other when it comes to questions like raising the minimum wage, like higher taxes, like the right to affordable housing, all issues that you've sort of touched on as being issues that are driving the agenda. What do you think the Social Democrats or a Chancellor Scholz or Kanzlerkandidat Scholz would have to do to bring the Free Democrats on board in a potential coalition?
Well, obviously, it's a bit premature, and normally you do not do negotiations or negotiation tactics, even in this closed environment. First of all, I'd like to say that this is a normal situation that we have in Germany, that after election, parties are tasked with forming a coalition, even though election manifestos seem not to fit. I mean, if you look at the 2017 manifesto of the SPD and the one of the CDU, it's hard to imagine how a successful grand coalition can be formed out of these two manifestos. But we managed to have a successful negotiation, a coalition treaty. Olaf Scholz has participated, I think, now in 4 coalition negotiations on the federal level, and one in Hamburg when he forged this coalition with the Green Party. And I would describe him as one of the most experienced political negotiators that we have. And so I'm pretty convinced that we can figure out things that will be a solid base for a coalition, if necessary, and if we were to come in a position that we can actually have the Chancellor. And so if you look, for example, at a possible traffic light coalition, you can call it as the, let's say, doers coalition, or yes, we can coalition. So I think if you take a look into these 3 programs, all 3 parties have an approach that they want to achieve something, that they want to bring Germany forward, be in digitalization, be in fighting climate change. And there is a strong history of social liberal coalitions. I mean, Helmut Schmidt and Willy Brandt, they governed together with the liberals. And you have a very successful traffic light coalition in Rhineland-Palatinate, with the very popular Malu Dreyer as minister president, and the now Secretary General of the Liberal Party used to be her deputy, and as Minister of the Economy. So I do think that there is enough common ground, and maybe just to make the Americans understand how this works in Germany. In the US, you have 2 parties. So you as a voter need to decide and make your decision on the coalition before election day. And if you look at the spectrum that you have, for example, in a Democratic Party, from, let's say, the hedge fund manager, multimillionaire in New York, the drag queen in Los Angeles, the blue collar worker in Pennsylvania, and the Black Lives Matter activist in Alabama, just to have the stereotypes ready. Mm-hmm. They do not have so much in common, but they are all part of a Democratic Party. And if you look at how an election manifesto is negotiated with the Bernie Sanders camp, the Biden people, the Warren people, AOC, then you see that you do this before the election. In Germany, the voter is in a very comfortable position. He or she can vote kind of a la carte. And so if you tend to think that the ecological question is the most important, then you vote green. If you think social things and then you vote for the left wing, and then you have the CDU, and then you have the SPD, and then you have the liberals. And all these parties would in the US probably be part of the Democratic Party. So in our process, we can vote a la carte, but then after election day, we task the politicians with what you have to do as a voter in the US before the election. And as you are capable of deciding between two parties, I think politicians should be able to form a government, because that's what they have to do. That's their job. And that the people with their decision and their vote task them to do.
It's a great way of describing it, and it's an important point, but it reminds me of something that I've been hearing recently, that some observers have been saying, that some voters might have buyer's remorse. They might vote in support of Scholz becoming the Chancellor, but they might then find that they've bought an SPD that has a somewhat different platform and goes in a different direction from what the candidate has been saying and doing. And so as we start to sort of wrap up our conversation, I guess one question that I have for you is what you think a government led by Olaf Scholz might look like, and what might it do differently from the government over the last 16 years that have been led by Angela Merkel?
Well, first of all, when Olaf ran in Hamburg, he stole, I think, from Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, I don't recall, this phrase of "don't campaign different than you govern." And so I think what you vote for is what you get. And you have an election manifesto with the SPD, and Scholz will stick to that. And so I think voters can be assured that they don't get anything different that they expect. Then I think what this new government needs to tackle, and today we had a big climate strike of thousands, 10,000s, 100,000 of young people at the streets, is obviously climate change. And just to give you an idea, Germany decided to phase out of nuclear, which is for many countries the easy way out of CO2 emissions. So we're phasing out of nuclear electricity by the end of next year. And then we decided that we want to phase out of coal at the latest in 2038. And we want to become net zero in 2045. So 2045 is less than 25, actually 24 years. And so our economy, our wealth depended on burning coal and gas. And this lasted for 250 years since industrialization. And now we have less than 24 years to reverse course. So that is, I think, a challenge that the next government needs to tackle from day one on. And this, I think, is something that was criticized rightfully with previous governments, that they did not fully understand the size of that challenge. And then I think Merkel is rightly praised and perceived as a great leader all over the world. But even in her own party, there are some critics. And I think these voices were raised now louder, that sometimes you have the feeling that she is also lacking a clear plan and not giving the country a direction where it should go. And so a former party leaders of the SPD once put it in the way saying, look, Mrs. Merkel is an excellent pilot. I would always board the plane where she is in the driver's seat and flying the plane. And I would know that I would land sound and safely. I would just not know where. And this notion of she is good in managing, she's good in the political maneuvers, but then also this notion that she's more of leading from behind kind of leader, waiting where the ship and where the tide is going to, and then jumping the ship. That is something that I would say has come to an end after 16 years, and people want more direction and more leadership. And hence, I sometimes quote a journalist who in 2013 wrote a portrait about Olaf Scholz, and he said, Olaf Scholz is Angela Merkel with a plan. And I like the two elements of that, because he is like Angela Merkel when it comes to intelligence and being uncorruptible and being calm and competent. And that's one part that people like. And that's why I think they like him. And he's not pretending. He is like that. And he has always been like that. But then we need this with a plan element as well after 16 years, because people do have a gut feeling that there is things happening, be it the COVID pandemic, with kind of raised new questions, be it digitalization, be it wars, be it China, and all these things that they have a gut feeling that things are happening. They want answers from their politicians and want to see somebody that tells them, don't you worry, we have this, and here's what we want to do. And I think that's something that might be different from a very successful 16 years of Angela Merkel as Chancellor.
So, Wolfgang, that is a perfect segue to a final question that one of our viewers has posed, because you've shared with us a little bit what we might anticipate, what we might expect from a Chancellor Scholz. But our viewer correctly points out that foreign policy has not been much of an issue in the campaign. It certainly was not an issue in the three debates between the candidates for Chancellor. And so she asks what we might expect from Olaf Scholz on the global stage. And you started to touch on that a little bit in terms of kind of having a plan for dealing with issues that are domestic, but also global, whether it's climate, whether it's the pandemic, but also you mentioned China. So what do you think we might expect from Olaf Scholz in terms of foreign policy?
Yeah, great question. And indeed, it was not part of one of the three debates, but there was very early on one that actually started the season of the Munich Security Conference. I think it's still online, and you might want to watch it because you get some idea. So Olaf Scholz is a multilateralist and he's a transatlanticist. I mean, he's from Hamburg. Hamburg is a founding member of the Hanseatic League, probably the first beacon of globalization. And he used to be in his youth vice president, and don't be afraid, it sounds worse than it is, at the International Union of Socialist Youth, which is the youth organization of the Socialist International. Last president was Antonio Guterres, the now Secretary General of the UN, so the youth organization of the Social Democratic and Socialist Party. So he understands international politics. And then if you look at especially his last 3.5 years, obviously finance minister in the G7, in the G20, dealing with the IMF, now with this big crisis that COVID presented to us, dealing with the DISS, so the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, to deal with developing countries. And if you look at his initiatives, you could see that he truly believes in multilateralism, and he's actually a driving force. So one, I think, of his big achievements of the 3.5 years here in the finance ministry is that he, together with others, introduced the idea of a global minimum tax in the so-called inclusive framework in the OECD. And now we had an agreement at the G7 level, agreement at the G20 level, and in this inclusive framework of the OECD. So more than 100, I think now it's 134 countries, already said we're going to participate, all G20 countries, and this will bring more tax certainty and more fairness when it comes to taxation of the big digital, especially digital companies. And you could see that with COVAX. So Germany was a front runner in financing the vaccine initiative, Act A, the accelerator, to make vaccines available for everybody. Also in the developing world, we now finance COVAX with 2.2 billion euro. Now after the US finally jumped in, the second largest single donor and financier of this COVAX initiative. And now his latest idea that we discussed at the G7 level and now at the G20 level, and now it's the official German governmental position, is the International Climate Club. So to deal with different systems of carbon pricing or indirect carbon pricing like in the US, and to avoid a fully fledged trade war when countries or regions start to implement carbon border adjustment mechanisms in order to fight carbon leakage so that their industries would not move overseas. So you can see that he believes in international institutions, and he comes up with solutions in order to avoid having countries or regions fighting each other. And he is a strong supporter and a believer of Macron's notion of European sovereignty, because we do believe that we won't see a G2 world only with the US and China, but a unified European Union, and probably other countries from Africa and from Asia will also emerge and have a saying, as will Russia. And so what we need to do is to find common ground on things like climate change, and then to have a pragmatic approach. And he once said, when he was the Minister of the Interior in Hamburg, he coined that phrase saying, "I'm liberal, but not stupid." And I think you could apply that to his China policy or his way he deals with Russia. And maybe a final word, I think that is something that you see in Germany and you have seen throughout the years, that we have a lot of continuity. So don't expect, with none of the three candidates, to be very clear, a sudden shift in foreign policy. We will be, under all three chancellors that are possible, a reliable partner. So don't be afraid.
Well, Wolfgang Schmidt, I want to thank you so much for taking some time at what is a very busy time to speak with us today. You've given us some tremendous insights on Olaf Scholz, but also on the Social Democratic Party and where the two of them have been, but where they're headed as well. I hope for you that we've been able to provide a little bit of a distraction over the last hour so that you haven't been biting your nails too much, but all of us will be watching the results on Sunday and are very curious about what will happen next. But thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephen. And let's see, as we all know, the future is unwritten. So let's wait until the fat lady sings.
Exactly. We will do that. One last word to our viewers, that on Monday morning, New York time, we will be holding a 2-hour debriefing on the election. We'll be doing this together in partnership with Atlantikbrücke and the German Marshall Fund. It is not too late to sign up for that discussion. And over the course of next week, we will have several events that focus on the German election results and what they mean. So until then, I hope to see you all at those events, but I wish everybody a good weekend and stay healthy. And once again, Wolfgang, herzlichen Dank and hoffentlich bis bald.
Thanks to you and thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.